everybody, it's Carter, and welcome to this episode of Making It Up, the conversation series where I sit down and I talk to writers of all backgrounds, of all levels of experience, of all genres and nonfiction as well. It's all over the place. But I will say I do tend to talk to people who are fiction writers, who are novelists, and who tend to write in the suspense, mystery, thriller genres, but not necessarily. And most writers that I talk to, depending on how long they've been writing for, you might know them and know them as a certain type of writer. Oh, he's a thriller writer. Oh, she writes romance, or she writes mystery. The truth is, a lot of people, when they're starting out, they don't know what to write. They want to write, and they have a lot of great ideas, but nobody really ever strikes out and says, I'm going to be a thriller writer. In fact, my very first novel that I wrote, that I was very fortunate enough to get an agent with, but never sold, and you probably have heard me say that time and time again, it was my agent who said, oh, you're a thriller writer. I'm like, oh, I had no idea. Okay, that's cool. But I was just writing the story that I wanted to write. And so a lot of novelists will dabble in different things, and just, it takes a while to figure out what it is that you're good at, what it is that excites you, that you enjoy the most. And you can, and many successful writers will still do the same thing, and write under many different genres and maybe under many different names, because they just have so many different types of stories that they want to tell. And I bring all of this up because my guest today has dabbled in a lot of different types of writing, and namely lots and lots of short stories, and now 2 novels with a collection on the way. So today I talked to Chris Riley. So Chris is up there in Sacramento, and he's doing the things that writers need to be doing, right? He is just spending a lot of time on his laptop putting words down, and because he loves it, but then he's taking the time to say, okay, how do I get this out? How do I find an agent? How do I market this? So we had a pretty in-depth conversation around the industry and around what are the things that a writer needs to be doing in order to get heard. He made the comment at one point, which he's correct, in that, for somebody to hit or for something good to happen in an industry that's terrifically difficult to break into, it takes a lot of luck. And I kind of countered with the cliche of like, you make your own luck. But he was talking about specifically how, one of his queries just happened to find this agent at the right time, and that was lucky. And the reality of it is maybe there was luck involved, but if not for his tenacity to keep, querying agents and not giving up after, 50, 100, 150 rejections, that's how you make your own luck. So I think there's a lot of good nuggets in this interview, especially for aspiring writers, about, what are the things that you should be thinking about, and, what is the psychology behind being a writer, and what does it mean? Specifically, if you're setting out to be a writer because you see it as a career move, and you see it as a way to like support yourself, you're probably not in it for the right reasons. If you're doing it because you're like, I don't know how to write, but I've got a story I want to tell, so I'm going to figure this shit out, that's probably the right reason. That means you're probably going to be passionate about it because you're inspired by the challenge of it all. So it's great talking to him. He's got a lot of good advice. He's had a tremendous amount of experience with all of these different topics. So I think anyone listening to this is going to glean a lot of great information from it. His most recent work is The Broken Pines, which has not only a beautiful cover, but it's got an amazing blurb from James Rollins, the #1 New York Times best-selling author. So that is always cool to be able to get a blurb like that. So all right, this is it. Enjoy our conversation. This is me talking to Chris Riley.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Good. Yeah, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well. Thanks for joining the podcast. How you doing today?
I'm doing all right. It's surviving this Sacramento area heat wave we have this week.
Yeah, you kind of read about that everywhere. It seems like it almost seems not even the exception anymore.
Yeah, brutal summers out here.
So I grew up in California. Are you from the Bay Area? Or is
No, I'm not actually.
Sacramento?
No, so I grew up in San Diego, actually.
Oh, okay.
And much better weather down there. And then I graduated and went to college at Humboldt State, which is way at the near the Oregon border,
right,
and on the coast. And so Pacific Northwest, I actually really like that weather. Cloudy all the time, a lot of rain, but it kind of just suits my my personality, I guess.
Yeah.
And then we moved out here to this area. I live in Roseville, actually, which is near Sacramento.
Okay.
Been out here since 2003.
Okay.
Raising kids, working, all that.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would like to move back to the Pacific Northwest at some point.
Yeah. You have to kind of do what you have to do, and I've been fortunate in that my wife and I at the time, this is 25 years ago, moved to Colorado from Miami for work, but fortunately it turned out to be like totally the right choice. But it's kind of like you have to go where the work is. And for writers, as you know, everyone has this like idea that, well, shit, you're a writer, you could do that anywhere. I'm like, well, 99.9% of writers need to do something else as well.
Correct.
It's not just about writing. So you got to figure out where you're going to go do that and then just write from there. That's the dream though, right? Is that you go get that cabin in Vermont and you just live off the land like Thoreau and write your little books. But that is the vast exception of writers who are able to do that.
Yeah, I see that happening for me in retirement. That's my goal. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I get that cabin when I retire, and yeah, I would love that. I would love to just sit and read and write. Take walks on the beach in the forest, and then go back and read and write.
Yeah. It's a weird thing, the trajectory of a writer's career, because I would argue that most writers wouldn't even call it a career, because you have this, and I'm totally speaking for myself, you have this imposter syndrome for a fucking very long time, where you don't even like calling yourself a writer because you're not really making much money on it. And so then the idea of like, you're a full-time writer is just so far beyond the realm of thought. You have almost like what you just said, I'll do it when I retire, as opposed to a book is going to hit and it's going to provide me the income that I need in perpetuity somehow to do this full time.
So if I can comment on that real quick, one of my favorite authors is Dan Simmons, and he writes historical fiction and horror, science fiction. So he's an inspiration of mine in many ways, and I always like to read the back of the books, stuff that he's done and so history in his past. Well, he used to be a school teacher, which is what I am. That's how I keep paying the bills. But this was back in the 90s, and I think it was his book Carrion that he basically just gave up his job, cashed out his pension, and told his wife, I'm going to be a full-time writer. And he did that. Yeah. So, I mean, I remember reading that, thinking to myself, and this was several years ago when I read that, and I was like, wow, I can't even fathom doing that. Yeah. I wouldn't do that. That's too risky for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting topic that maybe we can get into a little bit here, because it is, if folks that listen to this show and other writing podcasts, a lot of them are aspiring writers, struggling writers, what have you. And you're just trying to wrap your head around, what is this profession? And so many people I talk to, in fact, the people who I know who are full-time writers almost always have a partner, significant other who is helping with the income. So it's not like you're the sole breadwinner and you're just going to try to write. I have a friend, I'm not going to name her, and we had a call probably about 6 months ago because I was just curious because she transitioned from being an attorney to a full-time writer about 6 years ago because she had one book that did particularly well. And, it's a struggle to this day. It's a struggle for her. It's maybe struggle is not quite the right word, but it's not like you have a hit and then the hits keep coming. That's very rare. It's a very cyclical career path. So, she'll get to points where she's like, fuck, what am I going to do? I need more money. And then something good will happen and then she'll continue. But there's a level of stress there, even for established, popular, best-selling writers that, kind of doesn't ever go away.
So, and if you're okay, if I just comment on that.
This is your interview, my friend.
Okay. So, I know several writers. You connect with them through social media and whatnot, but it's such a lonely hobby that, it's always nice to talk to writers and share some of the stories. But I'm fortunate in that I do know a pretty famous author, James Rollins, and he's of the area. He's part of the writing group that I belong with, and I've met, I've been with him many times, and he's actually at the level where it's his sole income, or that I know of, and he's a successful author. But I remember one time we were talking, and he said this was several years ago. He had something with the publishing or the marketing element messed up, and they messed up on the promotion of one of his latest Sigma novels or something, and I don't remember all the details, but they didn't get the upfront promotion that he was supposed to, and he was pretty bummed about that. And I know that this guy is quite wealthy and has done very successful in the business, but he made this comment once. We're at the party, and he said, yeah, it bugs me because it says something to the effect like, if I don't do this and that, then my writing career will go down the drain. And he knew what he was talking about. I don't know the full specs on that, but I remember thinking to myself, man, I just got paid $150 for a short story. It's been months in the making.
Right.
And what do you mean your writing career would go down the drain? At that level where he's at, it's like, I don't know, you could probably just walk away from the mainstream publishers and just do and write. But, he's got enough to keep himself, good standing financially.
Yeah, it's all about that outside perception, and that happens not only to non-writers, but it happens to writers with other writers. Like, you look at somebody successful and you're like, oh, you've got it made. Whatever you write is gold, and that's not necessarily true. Mm-hmm. And then people on the outside, look at us, and you have one book out there, say, and they're like, oh, so you just do this full time? Like,
exactly, yeah.
What are you, insane? So I mean, I'm actually going through an interesting transition right now because I worked with this company for 13 years. I ran their consulting division. We got acquired by a multinational, and the multinational came in and said, we're not doing consulting anymore. This is XYZ company. We're not. So they let me go earlier this year, but gave me this tremendous severance. And so for the last 5 months, I've just been full-time writer, and it's tremendous. And I don't, I'm planning to go upwards of a year before I look again, because I can do that. But now, having gone through this time of like living this life of this is what I do, you start doing other things, right? You start teaching, you start, focusing on social media and promotion. There's a lot of stuff you should be doing just besides writing. Well, you get to the point where your days are full with writing related activities. Like, how the hell did I ever juggle this in a full-time job for the last 20 years? So it's just a matter of perspective and momentum, I guess. But I have to say, I've reimagined my life a little bit because of this experience. It's been a blessing in disguise, for sure.
That sounds like it, yeah. And that comment, that topic about marketing, that's such a true point. And it goes from just like a basic, someone who just writes as a hobby, which for me is still still what it is, to somebody like James Rollins. And like he puts a book out, and he says he spends hours and so much of the several months just marketing. I don't know what all he does other than going and doing book signings. So at that level, so at the highest level of a writer, they spend a lot of time doing marketing. And then someone like me, who's just starting out, like I have this routine. I have this subscription to this website called duotrope.com. I'm not throwing any plugs out there, but it's what's been successful for me in 12 years of writing, because it gives me a contact to all the different markets out there, magazines. I had hundreds of short stories published. That's like how I cut my teeth on that. Right. But every Tuesday I get their newsletter that shows out there who the new publishers are and stuff. So like Tuesday is kind of like my marketing day when I'm actively writing, because I will spend my time that I have allocated towards writing checking out the new markets, and then I'll also use that time to do some of the other little things that I do. So yeah, marketing is definitely not what I thought. It was never on my radar when I started writing, and but it made itself known.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what I've learned, doing this is that there's a minimum level of PR and marketing that you need to do, depending on whatever level at. But regardless of the level, there's always a minimum, and that minimum might get bigger and bigger as you might get bigger and bigger. But you can do way more than that, and that kind of boils down to, maybe in the case of James Rollins, how much you love it. Some people love doing that stuff, and and it's like with anything, right? You're going to do more if it's something that you love. Most writers eschew it, because most, to totally have a stereotype here, most writers are kind of introverted. The last thing they want to do is shout to the rooftops about themselves. And it's a fine balance, but I am learning, and I have learned over the years, there's a balance. What I've done with every single one of my books, I've been traditionally published for every book. So every book has had an in-house PR and marketing team. Every single one of my books, I've hired my own as well to work together with those people, because I'm like, let's give this book the best possible shot it has. And if you have the money, I highly encourage people to do that, because it's just a different perspective that you can get, and you got to, assuming the teams work together, okay.
Yeah.
So let's go back a little bit. I'm just curious about, so you, obviously you've been writing for a long time, and I want to kind of go through that a little bit. Was this something that was an interest to you, when you were young, or was it, a love of reading that kind of begat a love of writing? Where did all that come from?
Yeah. So I remember daydreaming about being a writer as far back as when I was in 8th grade. So I thought about it, and I was into reading, but I had no idea how to do something like that. No one really teaches you how to write something like a story, not even in grade school, right? And then in college, my last year of college, I really got into reading. I got into reading fantasy books, probably because I saw the writing on the wall, which was I was going to be graduating, and I was terrified of that because I didn't know what I was going to do. So I was like distracting myself. But I read a lot of fantasy books, so that's kind of like the core of my passion. But then life got busy, and years went by, and it wasn't until I was 40 or so that I had thought about seriously, how do I get into writing? And so again, even at that age, I was like, what? I don't know how do I start? Yeah, I played around with a few things, wrote a couple chapters here and there, but it just wasn't. I didn't know where to go from there. So I figured, well, I like fantasy. I saw maybe I'll just read some of the best books to get kind of start from there. And I did a little Google search, and what's the top rated fantasy novels, and the first one that came up was the Game of Thrones series by George Martin. And I'd never heard of the guy at that time. Again, this was like 12 years ago. And so, and he was kind of a nobody. He's not like he is now. His website was kind of hokey. And back then, first, I think he just had the first 3 books out. But I read Game of Thrones and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like the best book in fantasy that I've ever read. So I went to his website and I was just curious and, you know, just to see, you know, more of the guy. And there he had a tab on his website that said frequently asked questions. And I just, out of curiosity, I read that. And someone asked him, one of his fans asked him, hey, how do I get into writing? It was like the perfect question because that was the question that I had. And his response to that was write short stories. You'll learn a lot from the craft. You'll cut your teeth. It'll kind of get you going and you might be successful enough to launch then a career from there. Because prior to that, I had run across short stories, but I always thought to myself, well, like, what's the point? You know, it's a short story. And, you know, I couldn't not even imagine anybody being financially successful doing that. So, but I started looking into that and writing short stories and it wasn't long, like within 2 months, I got my first story published. And then it was like cocaine, you know, or some kind of drug. Because I was like hooked on that, you know, just that validation component. And then I did my research and found like that website I mentioned, Duotrope, and just started plugging away. And, you know, and I still write short stories to this day. Yeah. So, and I've written several novels, 2 published, 1 forthcoming. Short story collection is coming out next month. So I've had a lot of publication success in the small markets and the independent publishers. But that was the start of it, was just that George Martin's old website.
So, you know, I mean, that advice of his really boils down even further to just write, you know. And yeah, I did the exact opposite. I started writing short stories probably after I had 3 novels. So I started with a novel, but it's just a matter of getting words on paper and sucking and eventually sucking less because you write more and more words. But I can see how that's actually, in your case, what you just said, because it can be so defeating, right? But if you write short stories, you know, A, the investment isn't a year. And B, you might get one published relatively quickly. And like you said, that validation is necessary and addictive. So to have that early on, you know, if you had written 30 short stories and had no luck with any of them, which is actually very common, who knows? You might be like, well, I guess I'm not good enough, or, you know, I don't like the rejection, so I'm not going to do this anymore. And that's what stops most people, right? Is all that rejection. And I'm sure, as you know, I'm sure when my first 3 books didn't sell, you know, so all those words didn't sell. And then you just have to look at it like, okay, well, how have I grown through this? And how do I use everything that I've done, not only in terms of the words that I've written, but the rejection that I've received? How do I bundle that all together to move forward? And the reality of it is it's amazing learning experience to have all of that. But in your case, it was with short stories, it sounds like.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head, Carter. And so many people, I've met authors, and I think so many of them take the path that you took, and it becomes a mistake for them because they don't get the validation, and 2, they get the rejection. If you write a novel and then you start submitting to agents, and 95% of them are not even going to respond, you're going to feel that's a rejection, and you're going to get washed out of the whole business pretty quickly because you're going to be so discouraged. I've seen many people that's been the case for them. But on the short story, starting with short stories, I've had so many rejections that, you know, in fact, Duotrope, I can go back and track. You know, the last time I checked, it was like over 1,100 rejections over the years. So many rejection emails from magazines or whatever, or from agents and stuff, that that has like zero effect on me. I mean, sometimes it's the positive, okay, I can check that one off, you know, but, so I think that's been, I'm very fortunate that I started that way, because if I had started the traditional way of just trying to crank out a novel, spend a year or 2 on it, and then you write something and now, you know, you think it's the greatest thing you've ever written, and now nobody wants to read it, you know, even, you know, that could be traumatic, you know.
It can be. Yeah. And it boils down to, first of all, why are you writing to begin with? Like,
Mhm.
are you doing it because you want to be published and because you want to make money, or are you doing it initially because you've got an interesting story in your head, you want to see if you can do it? If that passion is there, that typically makes rejection easier. Although I also get that you spend a lot of time on something you're passionate about and then no one wants it. That could be kind of brutal as well.
Mhm.
But then it boils down to mindset, right? Do you have growth mindset or do you have a fixed mindset? If you have a fixed mindset, you're probably going to believe that, writing is talent inherited. Or inherent. So you either have it or you don't, and that's it. And you don't like competition. If you have a growth mindset, you're going to take that rejection and be like, all right, somebody actually read it and told me why they didn't like it. How can I get better? How can I grow? How can I adjust? And you're going to grow your own talent. Maybe you have talent to begin with, but you're going to grow it. And I really think you have to have a growth mindset in order to be a writer.
Yeah, we're really lucky, of a fixed mindset. Yeah, growth mindset for sure. Yeah, there's a lot of nuances in there, but definitely that I see myself grow quite a bit as a writer, and some of the things that were just scary for me. At least the idea of writing a query letter for an agent, right? That I remember when I started with that, and I did some research, and there's like there was like websites that have, this was years ago, but websites that had like tips and the whole science of.
Sure. I know through all of that.
Yeah, I was like, none of that was. I've had agents. Literally, my first book published was like, I just kind of threw it out there after hundreds of queries. I emailed an agent one day, and I just caught him at the right time. He was at home sick, and he just breezed through my query letter. It was just like nothing special. And he asked for the whole manuscript. 30 minutes later, I sent it to him. Call me back on Monday, man.
Yeah.
So that was my first deal on that. So,
but
first book.
And you might call that luck. And I think there is an element of luck to all of this. But to use a horrible cliche, you make your own luck, right? He read that because you just kept trying. You didn't send it to 10 agents and then give up, because that would be insane.
Right.
I think I was very lucky to get an agent with that first book that didn't sell, and I'm still with her today. But I think I had 75 rejections before I got to her. So the tenacity is a major element of writing. If your goal is to get published, is you just have to keep doing it, and you're not going to keep doing it if you don't love it. Because why would you subject yourself to all of that pain and torture for something you don't even like? So I do think that passion is absolutely the most necessary thing. And if you have it, then you will figure out how to write when you have a full-time job, and how to keep sending query letters when you keep getting rejections. But without it, I think it's just one of those. It's like me when I wanted to play the guitar. I'm like, I want to learn how to play the guitar. So I took lessons for like 3 years. I got okay. And then it stopped because it wasn't a passion of mine. It was something that was interesting, but it was nothing that I really wanted to pursue.
Right. Yeah, it's definitely been a passion of mine, the writing has. And then also what comes with it is patience. And I've learned this, I will never forget. One of my first, in the beginning of my writing career, so like in the first couple of years, I would submit short stories, write short. That's all I did was write short stories. I mean, I wrote short stories about 5 years before I wrote my first novel. And I just sent it out, and I remember I queried this one editor because I was waiting for a response. It'd been like months. And his reply to me was classic. I got to write it down, because he said something like, the story's still in the slush pile. My advice to writers is to write, submit, forget about it, start writing some more. And that was key. And that has held true for everything. So, and even for novels. And so having that patience where even if, like, for example, I have a short story collection coming out, and it's weird, dark fiction. I write under a couple different genres. And I wrote those stories for that collection a few years back. for a specific publisher who rejected it. And there's not very many publishers in that genre that I could focus on. But lo and behold, the publisher opened up a couple of years ago, and I submitted to them the collection, and he took it. And so just having patience. So yeah, there's a saying where, yeah, a friend of mine mentioned that no story is worth ditching ever, because there's always an opportunity for it to be sold or be published at some point.
Yeah, exactly. And that kind of goes back to, if you have the ability to, shop that, but then move on to the next thing, that probably means you have a passion for writing. If you write one thing and like, nothing ever happened with it, so I quit. Okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a cool thing to try, but it's not your thing. So what was the thought process behind transitioning from short stories to long fiction?
Okay. So, a couple of years had gone into it, and I started becoming more successful with my short stories, had a couple of pro sales, whatever. And this actually, I felt like I was ready to write a novel, and but I still didn't quite know how. And then probably what hit me was probably the part of the muse. I'm a big time. I used to swim all the time. So I'm swimming laps one day, and I will never forget the idea for my first novel came to me as I was swimming laps. And my first novel is Sticking to the Angie Piper. And so I thought, okay, and that's happened multiple times. So so a couple days later, I wrote out a short story. It was very short. It was like 3,000 words long, and I wrote it out, and it was very, very it was a literary story. It was very touching. My wife read it and cried, and it was the first time of all my stories that I've read. I read a lot of horror too. My wife won't read that, but that it was the first time I wrote a story that kind of like hit me. And I thought to myself, now this would be a longer version. This would be a good novel. So that was the start of it. And it was probably about a year later that I started to do it, because I started doing research on it. The whole story, it takes place in Alaska. I used to work up there. Basically, it's a coming of age story. Main character told first person, and his best friend they work on a crabbing boat. The best friend is a young man with Down syndrome. He's like super strong, high functioning Down syndrome. So the boat, anyway, I don't want to get into the full details of the story, but I did my research. So I spent about a year doing research on commercial crabbing, and then also how to write a novel. And it turns out I was talking to James Rollins one day, and he said there's like two different writers. There's the writers that like model everything out and outline chapter by chapter, and then there's the organic writers. And I knew right away I was going to be an organic writer. I'm not like a type A personality where everything has to be bullet pointed. So I knew also my experience with writing from short stories that for me, sometimes it could just be the title of the story that hits me, and then I go from there. But usually it's an idea, and then there's an ending. Have those things two together, then I'm golden. I can write the story. And I knew that I already had that for the Sticking to the Angie Piper. I had the idea, I didn't quite have the title, but I had that ending. And so then I just started putting my time into it, writing chapter by chapter, and it worked. It came out. So.
Yeah, you gravitate. I think most people gravitate towards whatever type of writer that they are, whether they're a plotter or a pantser. I'm a pantser. I don't even know my ending.
Pantser, I like that. Yeah.
Like ever. Yeah. But what I love, so I think and it also depends on the level of your curiosity, because any short story, you could look at it and get to the ending and say like, okay, well, what if this happened next? And that what if, I think, is the critical part of writing, is like that constant curiosity of like, well, what if this happened? What if this dude just died right now? What would that mean? And you write it, and maybe it sucks and you do something else, but it's just that constant asking of that question propels fiction, right? So that all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, I just wrote 100 pages because I'm trying to figure out what's going on with this person. And that to me is where the joy of writing comes from, is sitting down every day and not really knowing what's going to come next. And you get there and you're just like watching a movie, like, okay, what's going to happen? I don't know, but what if this happened? And to me, I couldn't do it any other way. I've tried to outline, and within 5 pages, I immediately am deviating because I think of something more interesting. I'm always impressed with people who can just see it all, and they can put together a 10-page outline and really deviate very little from it in terms of the major plot structure as they write the book. I'm like, how did your brain figure all that out so quickly? I need that process of actually putting the words on the paper for the new ideas to come out. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, no, and then the magic of that muse taking over, which is, I've experienced that so many times that it's phenomenal. And that to me, I don't know of another way. I don't know if that could happen if you're outlining everything, probably, but that. And then what you said also reminds me of, so Stephen King's book on writing. I'm sure you've read that. Mm-hmm. It's a great book. And, he talked about the writing process is like, it's an archaeologist and he's unearthing, some fossil. He's not sure what the fossil, what is it of? He's not sure what kind of creature it is, but so many words that he says. So it's like, it's this mystery that he unearths. And that's totally what I've experienced. And, it's, I love it. I love that. You experience that.
It's where the fight. So my book, The Comfort of Black, I kind of outlined maybe the first, I don't even know, maybe the first 100 pages. And it starts with this guy, the protagonist, and I had this whole image of him, and he's driving to work on the Washington Beltway. And immediately, I'm like, I don't know, he's kind of an asshole. I had the sarcastic, anyway, so I'm writing him and I'm like, I don't know if I like this guy. So I had him stop to help a stranded motorist, which wasn't in the outline. And then all of a sudden he's standing there and I'm like, there's no way he's not getting hit by a car. He has to get hit by a car. So I have him get hit by a car, and then that completely destroys my outline. But it was so much more interesting to have that happen, because that unearthed all sorts of stuff about him that I didn't realize. So, and the muse is an interesting point, because I think, to your point, that the muse can take over, and when you're a little bit even out of body when you're writing, when it's just flowing, because all of a sudden you're seeing it. But the double-edged sword of that is people who rely on the muse, and they glorify what's really just creative bursts, right? And then they don't write because the muse isn't there that day. And that is a killer to writers. I think more important than waiting for the muse is to write every day, whether you like it or not. Treat it like a job, because it's a job. Some days it's going to suck. A lot of days it's going to suck. Well, a lot of days it's hard, but if you just wait for those moments where you think the muse is going to come, it's going to take you 10 years to finish anything.
So, Corey, can I add to this a little bit? Because I guess my interpretation of the muse is a little bit different than what you just said. So there's muse and then there's inspiration. And so for me, when I refer to the muse, I'm referring to part of what you said was where something sort of takes over. And there's been 2 cases in my writing. There's been multiple cases where I felt that, but it's not something that I rely on. It's like I start writing and then I notice it happened. Two examples. At the beginning of my career, I was working at this department store, part-time. And there was one of my managers who was there, who, I'll be quick about this, but he was a nice guy, but I always had this feeling about him, like, this guy is like a serial killer. He could be a serial killer. And I was writing horror, and then I wrote this horror story called The Supervisor. It got published. And as I was writing it, I was thinking of him. Mm-hmm. And I'm writing this whole story where this new supervisor, this guy works at an office, and this guy's a serial killer, and blah, blah, blah. So it's a novella. It's a little thriller novella. And the character in the story, as I wrote this, had his mind on Jack the Ripper and thought that his supervisor was like Jack the Ripper. Okay, fast forward to like a month later or so, the story gets published. I'm at work. I'm talking to my supervisor, this guy, who was the inspiration for me writing that story. And we're talking one night, and I said, "Oh yeah, he knew that I like to write." And he said, "Yeah, my brother's a writer. Who's a lawyer actually, but he's writing a book about our I don't want to get into names here. So this falls back, but basically his brother was writing a book about who they thought their great uncle was. I'm like, well, who was that? And he says Jack the Ripper.
Wow.
I was afraid to go home that night. For the second story, a novel which I published and I'm currently editing. It's the second in a series. The first one that's going to get published in February with my current publisher. I don't see why they wouldn't take my second one. And it's but there's a scene where I have these characters. It takes place in the Deep South, and these two characters, and I write them out as like, so I refer to them, in the book as a real life George and Lenny, John Steinbeck's George and Lenny, I'll bet with some criminal tendency. These two guys, and so imagine George and Lenny as criminal brothers in the Deep South, and so I write this novel with these characters, and they have a subplot in the story. And at one point, the big dumb guy, he gets into a fight with his cousin. But before he does that, he goes out of his trailer, and he sees it's a really tense part of the novel. It's like where all this action, it's the big climax of the novel. He sees a rooster, all right, and the rooster looks at him and starts talking, and just like, degrading them, calling them all these names, and the voice of his mom, who's long passed away. And he's confused. He's low intelligence, and he doesn't quite know what to make of it. Eventually, a few scenes later, he's in the barn fighting with his cousin, and the rooster walks in. It's life size, and it's talking to him. And this is just before he passes out. So I wrote all of that, and keep in mind, John Steinbeck is probably my all-time favorite author, and I've read Of Mice and Men many years ago. I write this novel, I complete that. It's done. I'll just copy edit it right now. And like months later, I sit down. This is like last year sometime. I sit down and I'm like, I'll just read Of Mice and Men. I haven't read that forever. I had completely forgotten the ending of Mice and Men. Not the full ending, but that part where Lanny walks down. He has to go to the river, right? Go to the river if he gets into trouble. So he goes to the river, and he runs across. It's a rabbit that is talking to him. So I
don't remember that either.
Yeah, so that whole scene, I had somehow, my subconscious had grasped that and put it into my novel, and I had referred to that character as a character, the real life version of Von Steinbeck's character. So that, to me, when I read that, like literally last year, I read the ending of Mice and Men. I was so floored. I was like goosebumps, how did my subconscious do that? Because I had
that's how it works.
I was not conscious of that. So my reference to the muse is those little magical moments that happen during writing, but not the inspiration. And the inspiration part with regards to like, well, people, you gotta have to be inspired. You have to have these routines to force yourself from writer's block. I've never experienced that. When I can sit down and write, I don't ever experience the writer's block portion of,
I don't think writer's block exists personally. And it's funny with the muse, because like what'll happen with me is because I'm not outlining, I'm just kind of shotgunning and writing straight through. And I guess I'm more actively aware or conscious or attuned to plot developments rather than, kind of thematic elements. So I'm just going through and making sure things make sense and making sure there's tension and this and that. And then about 2/3 of the way through the book, you just kind of sit back and you're like, oh, this is what the book is about. It's about loss or whatever it is. You realize like all these characters I've written have this thing in common, which I never planned, but it's just there. And I attribute that to your subconscious just working and being there, and you having the confidence to trust it, which is the big thing, because you can easily go down a path, especially if you're a pantser where you're critique shopping your book, you're getting people's feedback, and it's so easy to be tempted to take all of their advice, which is the absolute worst thing you can do. You need to listen to the advice, but then you need to trust your process, trust yourself, and incorporate what makes the most sense without losing sight of what it is your individual brain is trying to craft. And because otherwise you end up with a very, very two-dimensional book at the end.
That's really good advice, especially for people involved with like writing groups, because that could really derail your motivation or any of your projects. If what you just said, all the different, forms of advice and the different messages that you get.
Yeah, totally. Well, listen, Chris, we're going to wrap up. Before we do, we're going to do a quick storytelling. I've taken the liberty of grabbing 3 books, more or less at random, off my bookshelves. I'm going to have you choose one of them, and then we're going to pick a random page and a random sentence from that page, and I'm going to read that sentence, and then that's going to kick off maybe a 2-minute long quick storytelling. So I'll read that sentence. You give me the next couple. We'll see where it goes. It can go horror. It can go romance.
Is this like one of those ad-lib type things?
Yeah. So this is basically improv. And the best part about it is we have to accept each other's premises, right? So you might thinking it's going to go this way, and then I say something that derails that, but then you have to just yes and that in a way. So it's a great.
You need like paper or pencil or anything?
You do not.
Okay.
So I've got 3 books here. I have Lars Kepler's The Mirror Man, Sean Cosby's Blacktop Wasteland, and Greg Isles' Cemetery Road. So choose one of those.
I'll go the first one, The Mirror Man. That title sounds pretty interesting.
Creepy ass book. It's Lars Kepler is actually the nom de plume of a married couple who live in Scandinavia. And I actually hosted their online launch event, and I just am fascinated by the idea of a married couple just writing multiple novels together. I just think it's fascinating. So pick a page between 1 and 400.
99.
Okay. So let me just quickly find a sentence that.
Blank page.
Okay. It's the end of a chapter.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay. I'm going to read the very last sentence of this chapter.
Okay.
He must have been at the playground before the police arrived.
All right. When am I supposed to do something?
Oh, sorry. So now give me the next maybe sentence or two that
Okay.
happens after that. He must have been at the playground before the police arrived. Or I can go first. Whatever.
Well, I would say, yeah, my first thing that comes to mind is, but he was gone, but later he was gone.
The detective scoured the ground looking for any kind of evidence beyond the body that they had already found. If the killer had already left, she wondered how long ago it had been. And that's when her gaze caught the small red object just beneath the slide. As she got closer, she saw it was a popped balloon.
Encapsulated by a single eyeball. Or covering a single eyeball with green tentacle-like appendages sticking out of it.
She called her partner over, told him to get close, but not too close. You ever seen any kind of shit like this? She asked him.
Miles took a sip, gave a thoughtful glance to it. After a few long seconds, replied with, all the time.
It's probably some kind of crazy seafood that somebody left behind. People eat the weirdest shit. It's probably nothing. It's probably from that sushi restaurant down the road. But she disagreed, and she got out her tweezers and gently lifted it and brought it closer to her face.
At that moment, the eyeball popped, and a black, scarab-looking creature jumped up, took flight, and flew away. She looked at her partner. He took another sip, smiled, and just replied with, all the time.
I think we'll call it there. You are a horror writer.
Yeah.
You like to get into the good grisly stuff.
Oh yeah, why not, right?
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, listen, man, congrats on the upcoming novel and for the other two that you already have out. And it was a pleasure to talk to you. And maybe we'll meet up at the writers conference or something good like that.
Yeah, I'd love it. Thank you, Carter.
All right, buddy. Take care.
Bye.
All right, friends, that is it. That is my conversation with Chris Riley, whose most recent book is The Broken Pines. I enjoyed our storytelling. It got a little gruesome. I like the idea of an eyeball with a scarab inside of it. That's great visceral imagery. If you want to find out more about Chris, and I highly encourage that you do, just go to chrisrileyauthor.com where you can buy his books and read all about him. And I encourage you to go to my website, carterwilson.com. You can sign up for my newsletter. You can buy my books, check out for my events, see if I'm doing any more retreats, all of that good stuff. So that is it. That is it for this episode of Making It Up. I hope you all are well. There will be other episodes coming out very soon. In the meantime, thank you as always for watching and or listening. Take care.